I've really been looking forward to today's conversation. We were just catching up a little bit before we started and realized that we haven't talked with each other since the mid 1990s. So it's been a little while since we've talked, but it's going to be a good time hanging out today and catching up. I think the first time I met Michael, I believe I was in 8th grade, which would have been in the early 1990 area. And I think we were in district honor band in the state of Georgia together. And then after that, we played in some ensembles together throughout high school. And I was one of those things that I knew right out of the gate from meeting him that he was going to go on to do great things in the world of percussion. And he has done exactly that. He went on to receive a Bachelor of Music at Oberlin, studying with Michael Rosen, and then did a master's degree at Cleveland State. And now he's the principal percussionist in the Dayton Philharmonic and is the Director of Percussion Studies at Miami University in Ohio. And I just cannot wait to find out about all these cool things that he's doing. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Michael LaMattina to the podcast. Hey, Michael.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to see you again. And how are things? I know you're preparing for a concert tonight. You're wrapping up the season.
Yeah, this is our last classical set of the season. And then we are doing one more set of Pops concerts, all John Williams and movie music in a few weeks. But yeah, tonight is our last, what we call masterworks in our orchestra. So we're doing Dvorak's New World Symphony. And then there's a community choir doing some arrangements of gospel music and spirituals.
Nice. So do you play, do you do much drum set with the orchestra? Do you tend to specialize in one thing and then hand off other stuff to other players, or how does that work?
Right. Well, I'm the principal percussionist. So assignments, that's part of my job, making assignments. And the way most sections work is there's kind of a go-to player that does, the snare, mallets, somebody who more or less does most of the cymbal work, and then somebody who would play bass drum, triangle, things like that. But we do so many different things. We also do opera and ballet. And our personnel isn't always the same from concert to concert. It's pretty fluid. I mean, me and the second player, we kind of interchange between mallets and snare drum. When it comes to drum set in an orchestra, that's somewhat of a touchy issue. If we're doing a Pops concert that doesn't have a guest on the program, who oftentimes guests will request a certain drummer to come along with the program, or they'll bring their own drummer. If that's not the case, then I'll usually do the drum set playing. And playing drum set in an orchestral setting is really different from playing, in a rock band or a big band or something. And a lot of people actually shy away from it because you wind up hearing a lot of musicians' complaints about how you're keeping the time, or you're ahead or behind, so that took a little while to ease into. And that was one of the biggest challenges, actually, when I started the job here. Our previous principal timpanist did a lot of the set playing, and then I kind of worked my way into doing drum set for Pops programs, or if there was set, on a piece for a classical program or something, I would also do it. And a lot of it has to do with just everybody getting used to the way you negotiate, following the conductor's beat, and then trying to figure out how 80 other people feel a time, And a lot of that too deals with the setup. If you're all the way in the back, way apart from everybody else, it's going to be problematic. So usually with the drum set, I'll usually like to set it up in front of this percussion section, kind of by the woodwinds or behind the second violins. I used to go over to the brass, but the way our stage is set, it was a little difficult for me to get from the section to the drum set if I was between the brass and the double basses. So we've kind of figured that out at this point. And when there is a set part that's called for, that there's not a guest bringing their own drum set player, I'll usually do the drum set work.
Yeah. That's always such a weird compromise, I feel like, where, in the drum set world, we're kind of, trained from the beginning to hold down the time for the ensemble. Then you move into that situation where everyone is so trained to follow the conductor, and then you just kind of have to figure out that balance of who is supposed to follow who.
Yeah, some people just won't touch it, and they'll pass it off to somebody else, or they'll have an extra musician come in to do like the regular set work. With the Cincinnati Symphony, it's very close. They kind of have somebody like that. He's not technically in the section, but he's more or less a fourth player, and he does all the drum set for the Cincinnati Pops. They do a lot of pops, and then usually set parts that are incorporated into, say like John Adams' City Noir or something like that.
Yeah. How many concerts, how many weeks is your season with the orchestra?
So the Dayton Philharmonic, we're actually Philharmonic, ballet, and opera. We merged together all three companies, and I think it was 2012. So our season runs basically 39 non-consecutive weeks. Certain months are more busy than others. Like December is usually a really busy month. We do Nutcracker, usually like an opera and a pops, and something like film with orchestra or something like that. And then other times of the year are a little less busy because we share our performance space with the management company. Also brings in like Broadway shows, things like that. So if there's like Lion King running for 2 weeks, anything we do will be offsite, like a church gig or a Parks concert or something like that. So the difference between, our type of orchestra, essentially per service orchestra, it's not like a 52-week year-round salaried, it's the same every week for a place like Cincinnati, or I don't know if Atlanta's 52 weeks anymore. There's not too many 52-week orchestras left. But part of the reason why I'm able to do the other things I do is because the time commitment is more flexible with our orchestra. And I sort of developed my career partially to kind of fill in those gaps, when we weren't playing, for a week or two or something like that. So yeah, we have 39 non-consecutive weeks. Some months, we might do 5 or 6 different programs. This June, yeah, we've got 4 different programs happening. May we did a lot of different programs, but they were all like really kind of short, contained service schedules. So
that's great. Yeah, and like you said, it frees up your schedule to do some other things that you may want to do, like teach, or if you want to travel, or if you want to go and do some other performance thing. It gives you a little bit more flexibility to do so.
Well, yeah, the way my college situation worked out, it probably couldn't be possible if I did, a normal 52-week orchestra, or normal, but, if I played in a larger ensemble, because there's so much daytime rehearsals and availability you needed for that. So, a busy week for me, say, if we're doing a masterworks or something like that, we'll usually have rehearsals in the evenings because a lot of other people in the orchestra are in similar situations. They'll have several other jobs. I'll teach at Miami University from about 10 to 5 and then go from there to rehearsal. And rehearsal's 7:30 to 10 usually. I don't necessarily always play on everything. I'm not needed necessarily the whole time, but it can make for a long day. But if I was needed for a 10 a.m. rehearsal and a 2 p.m. rehearsal, I wouldn't be able to, carry, a 20-hour workload at the university. Yeah. The other teacher we have at Miami does play in the Cincinnati Symphony, but he only teaches on Mondays, which is usually their off day. They usually work Tuesday through Sunday. So the way the equation worked out and the nature of my job at the university, it does sync up nicely with our orchestra schedule. Now, sometimes we do have daytime services, and I'll have to reschedule lessons. There's more flexibility in doing that, as opposed to the other way around, where I have no control over when rehearsals and concerts are scheduled. So
yeah, that's awesome. And we can go back to this in a little bit. We can move around a little bit, but how long have you had that position with the orchestra?
I got it in 2001, and I more or less started in 2002. So it's been 22 years now.
Wow. How old? So you were in your early 20s, right? When you got that
I was
gig?
just graduating. I was in my last semester of grad school. And the interesting thing about it is it was really the first audition after 9/11. I was going to be taking an audition in San Francisco on September 13th, but the attack happened and everything shut down. So they canceled the audition. And the next one that was open, the first one after, I was doing auditions as my last semester in school, was a DPO job. So I took that in October, started playing in December, and more or less, moved to this area in January of 2022.
Wow. It's funny how things work out, right?
Yeah.
How much your life has, I guess, kind of molded around that, the geography of where you are now. That's really, really cool. Yeah.
Part of, being a musician, especially an orchestral musician, is there's such a scarcity of work that there's so randomness to it. You kind of just have to go for whatever's available when it lines up with when your education finishes or what your situation is at that moment.
Sure.
So, I find, most people who do this line of work, there's kind of a window of time where they feel like they can be competitive at auditions. And for some people it works out, for others it doesn't. If you keep trying and you're never like settled down, you're kind of going to miss out on the rest of your life too. Yeah. So for most people, it's, you can get lucky and be set very early on. I think by the time I auditioned at Dayton, it was my 12th or 13th audition, because I had taken auditions as an undergrad and a graduate also. And then I did some afterwards, but I didn't feel like, especially once I started teaching at Miami, like there was a pressing need to go for anything more, unless it was like a really, really, top echelon job that came available. Yeah. Well, and one of the things I wanted to talk about on here, and we can talk about it now. I imagine a lot of the listeners of this podcast probably are not aware of the world of symphony orchestra auditions and just how incredibly stressful that whole thing is, and just the anxiety that goes around it. And, for the folks that don't know what all is involved in that. And I guess my follow-up for that is, what is in your memory, what's the most stressful audition you've had for an orchestra? Yeah. Okay. Well, percussion auditions in particular they're probably the most complicated because of all the equipment involved, and probably the most challenging for the applicants because you have to play on an instrument that you've really never touched before, and it's for keeps. If you were a violinist taking an audition, you get to play on your own instrument. For percussion, we get to play on our own snare drum, triangle, tambourine, smaller instruments you can take in. But in particular, the mallet instruments can be really difficult to navigate because the height might be different from what you're used to. The bar width would be different. And at a well-run audition, they'll tell you what you're playing. They'll give you the model number and specs about how high it is or how wide the bars are. But it's still not the same thing as getting a chance to play on it before the actual audition. Some places you do have the luxury of having a duplicate of the instrument in warm-up, which is great, but that's usually the exception. So you walk onto the stage, and most of the time mallets are first because if you drop a note or two, it's easier to cut people that way. Yeah. It's pretty clear cut. So most of the auditions I took, they did start on mallets, play a few on xylophone, a few on glockenspiel. If you played well enough, then you got to go into snare drum and then eventually tambourine and cymbals. Now with so many people taking auditions, the first round usually is about 5 or 6 minutes. So a couple things on mallets, maybe snare drum, and that's about it. It's all the time they have really to listen for. But like I said, the particular challenge with percussion is you've got all these sticks and mallets. It's all a lot of detail work, and sometimes it's hard to see past that and really focus on playing the music as opposed to thinking about what mallet am I using on this? Right. Sure. How's my snare drum sound on this? All these different things racing through your head. So the first thing it requires is just copious amounts of practice. I probably practiced, average of 8 hours a day as an undergrad. When I was in grad school, I was working. So my practice time was usually from 7 a.m. to like 1 p.m. And I do classes and then I work in the evenings because I was playing some orchestras at the time. And also with percussion, you really need to get into the habit of doing mock auditions where you have all the instruments set up like they would be at an audition, and you walk into the room cold and have to play through the round. So it's a somewhat hostile environment, and it's not the easiest environment to make music in. I will say, getting past the first round, usually things loosen up a little bit in the second round. They don't seem quite as cold and inhuman, because people behind the screen, most of them have had to go through the same things. So yeah, a good committee will give you the benefit of the doubt. If you drop a note here or there, you might get a chance to play it again. Again, there's so many different variables. the time frame is a really big one. If you're running short on time and you only have the hall for a certain amount of hours, you might feel like you're rushed through your round. So the other thing too is every audition is different. That's the most frustrating part of it. You might do something one place and do really well there, do the same exact thing somewhere else and not even get through the first round, because it's a subjective process. You can execute just as well, but if somebody finds you're playing bland or it's not the sound they're looking for, tough luck. So
yeah,
you have to, very few people get through the process without going through the experience of getting cut. I can't really think of anybody I know that didn't go to an audition, either bombed or played well and still got cut. One thing that is kind of true is, most people who do get jobs wind up advancing and getting into finals on a pretty regular basis. So there are some absolutes. Of course, minimizing the number of mistakes you make, obviously that's always going to help you. I found that focusing more on tempos and, maintaining the listener's interest is really important, because you could play very well, but kind of be boring and just the committee will just kind of tune out. And committees too, a lot of musicians on the committee aren't percussionists. They don't know this music. So they might hear things very differently. So again, there's so many different variables for each different one that it's just kind of a matter of numbers. And I started advancing pretty early on. There were some places where I thought I played really well and didn't advance. You asked about, the most difficult audition I ever took. And it was partially my own fault. My senior year at Oberlin, I did an audition in Buffalo, which I probably should not have, because the Friday night before we had an orchestra concert. We were doing Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, and I was playing timpani on that. And then the next day I did my senior recital. And then the following day I drove to Buffalo to play an audition. Wow. And of the three, the audition went the worst. And I really bombed on it. I did not play well. I shouldn't have done it. So I learned, from that experience that, these auditions require your full energy and your sole focus.
Yeah.
So I didn't ever do that again. There were some other times in auditions where I kind of got a weird vibe from the committee. Maybe I got out of the first round or something, and somebody just kind of like had your number and just weren't into what you were doing. That really did. I can't say that. I can't read somebody's mind, so I'm not totally sure. But sometimes, when there's no response from the committee, that's a little unnerving. That happened to me in Boston. I played a really good round, and it was just kind of like crickets afterwards. So
really,
yeah.
Wow.
I'm trying to think of any other really difficult. There was one time where I got into finals for Chicago, and there was some sight reading on it on the final round. It was for Principal Percussion, and they did their best to like 3 curves, and the sight reading was this jazz vibe solo, all handwritten, just pretty much the most difficult thing they could throw at you. And that didn't go so well.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But I would say, I kept track of, when I got advanced, when I got cut, when I won auditions. And percentage-wise, I did pretty well. I think I would say about half the time I was able to advance. So of all the auditions I took.
Yeah. Are you finding, or are the excerpt lists staying pretty consistent from what they were 25 years ago? Are they evolving, adding new pieces to it, or how is that part of it working?
Yeah, there are some standards that are always going to be there, like Scheherazade on snare drum, Capriccio Espagnol, Lieutenant Kiji, Poor Game Best will be on most lists, Sorcerer's Apprentice. But there are some newer works that are appearing. One is by Ligeti, a piano concerto, this really hard xylophone part. I think Boston had an audition recently where they put it on there. It's very, very difficult. I had to prepare it for an audition twice. Really, you could spend the whole time just working on that. And there's some more recent pieces by John Williams on vibraphone, Escapades, that's been appearing. And then City Noir, also really intense. That's John Adams.
The John Adams piece, yeah.
Another pretty intense vibraphone part. It's mainly newer mallet parts that seem to be popping up on lists. Anything involving timpani or the battery, it's pretty standard from 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I've just heard so many stories over the years of these insanely stressful auditions where you may go in. I remember hearing one years ago where the last thing they made people play was cymbals, like when you're just physically exhausted, and here you are having to hold these large crash cymbals playing Tchaikovsky, and you're just you're just physically done, and yet you're still having to.
The interesting thing about that, though, is that's probably a more humane way to go about it. Because if you had to do that and then play a really soft snare drum passage or xylophone part, it'd be even harder, I think.
That's true.
Usually that's why cymbals are last, because of the physicality of it. But I was, in that situation where I had to play Tchaik 4 on the orchestra cymbals that I'd never touched before, and they were like 20-inch cymbals and really heavy. And it's just usually for most people, the audition is the hardest part of the process. Now, if you get a job very young, sometimes the tenure process can be a little harder. You don't have experience. And that really does vary on the level of orchestra you're playing. Getting tenure as a really young player in one of the really big orchestras is a lot harder. I started in certainly not as big a job as like Cleveland or Atlanta or someplace like that. So my tenure process was a little bit easier. And I had experience, but, not a lifetime of experience, obviously. So that can be tricky. And it's not uncommon that, a young player wouldn't get tenure in an orchestra, even though they won the audition. So auditioning is a very different skill from playing the job. It's kind of a vacuum. What might work in an audition doesn't necessarily work on the job.
Well, and I would imagine that there are so many other factors that come into that tenure decision, as far as being a team player, how you are to work with, your musical maturity, right? Because you're having to show how you can come in and be prepared week after week playing material that that obviously isn't on the list, right? There's a lot of pieces of this that go with it.
Yeah. I had already had a couple jobs before I started in Dayton, smaller orchestras, and I'd gotten tenure at those as well. And I think the best thing to do is just to kind of do your job and just kind of lay low. And you might have opinions on something, but it's usually best not to voice them until you do get tenure. Because, you don't know who's on your tenure committee. Sometimes it's just the conductor. Sometimes it's a couple people. That's generally my approach anyway. Just kind of do my job and get along with everybody the best I can, and try to, do my part. So if you come in, you have a lot of fire and aggressiveness, that's not always the best way to go about getting tenure, I think.
Yeah, no. I would say that's probably an accurate statement about just about any field that you could go into. If you're the new person there, you might want to just kind of read the room for a while before you start sharing your feelings about everything. Yeah.
No, when I started here, there hadn't been there was never a percussion. It was I think one of the first percussion auditions they had, because when you're in an orchestra, it's not uncommon to have somebody in that position for 40 or 50 years. Our timpanist retired a couple of years ago, and he was in the orchestra for 60 years. He started when he was 18. So, I was coming into it. It was kind of a new situation for everybody. It was the first time there was a new principal percussionist in decades. So I was able to, I kind of had, I think, a pretty easy tenure process, honestly. So I wasn't having to fill anybody's shoes, and I wasn't trying to fulfill some type of tradition, which comes into play some places, playing things a certain way, that suits that ensemble. I pretty much had a clean slate to do what I wanted to and to play the parts, how I played them.
Yeah. That's excellent. So I want to go way back, and talk about the early part of your life playing percussion. I know you come from a family of percussionists, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Your dad and your brothers all play percussion as well. How many siblings do you have?
I have 3. My older brother still plays. My younger brother played a little bit, but just on the side. My sister played a little bit too, but it was mainly because my dad is a drummer. So we all at some point did lessons and participated in this drum show that he does, or he did at his job at his school every year. My older brother still plays. He's in the movie industry, and he plays with a band and on the side in Los Angeles. And we marched in drum corps together in 1993. And we also
Spirit,
played,
right?
Yeah, Spirit of Atlanta. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and my dad still plays. He's retired. He's a retired school teacher, but he still teaches and plays, the Metro Atlanta area. So he was my first teacher, and I started lessons with him. I kind of settled down when I was about 7 years old, sometime around then, when we were still living in New York. And I just kind of played for fun. My older brother was much more talented, naturally talented, and a little more serious when he was younger with playing. I started to latch onto playing when we moved from New York to Georgia, and I, became involved in sixth grade band and eventually youth orchestra. And I kind of gravitated towards mainly playing, when I was in high school, and settled on that by the time I was a junior in high school. But I pretty much just played drum set, for like the first 5 or 6 years that I played. And, I picked up mallets in middle school. And my band director was married to she still is, the principal percussionist with the Atlanta Symphony. So I got some pretty good exposure to orchestral percussion at a young age. And the youth orchestra in Atlanta is really strong, good program.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where my career kind of started, was rooted, basically.
Yeah. Who all did you study with other than your dad? Who were you studying privately with when you were living in Atlanta?
Yeah, in high school, there's one of my first private teachers is also an assistant band director at the high school I went to. His name was Ken Simpson. He kind of started me on mallets. And then I took some lessons here and there with some of the symphony guys, but nothing on a regular basis. Probably the most regular lessons I took were with Tom Wobenhurst at Georgia State University.
Yeah.
And I was really focused. I was hyper-focused on marimba playing all the way up until I was about 17. So between the ages like 14, 15, 16 into 17, I was pretty much exclusively just doing like 4-mallet marimba stuff and developing a repertoire. And I kind of wanted to go in that direction at first. And then I went to Boston University Tanglewood Institute in 94 and got more exposed to orchestral playing. And I don't think it really occurred to me that was a possible career path. And it was a good place to get exposed to that, because the Boston Symphonies are the whole summer. And that's kind of when I decided that probably would be more the direction I wanted to go, or go into orchestral playing than to become a recitalist or something like that, or soloist. Yeah.
So it's funny. I studied some with Jack Bell in high school, and then I did some summer music programs. I did Brevard 2 summers, and then went to Chautauqua in New York for 2 summers. And that's really it. Just being around like-minded people and being exposed to that world of it. It's so eye-opening. And I could see how it may have changed your path, your mindset for the path to move from being a solo player to being an orchestral player. I wanted to back up and ask about what are your feelings now about that season that you did drum corps? Did that help anything? Do you find where did that land with your path as a player?
Yeah, I did that in 92 and 93. And I think it's really good, really useful. Some of the other people that were on the circuit in other corps are actually playing professionally as well, in orchestral positions. Specifically, there's a guy I remember, he plays in Houston now. He played with Phantom Regiment. I would see him at shows sometimes. A guy named Kevin Bobo, who is at Indiana University now. He was March Cavaliers the first summer I was in Spirit of Atlanta. I was pretty young when I did it. It's like 15, a little younger than most, but it was pretty invaluable. I mean, there's pluses and minuses. I think more pluses for me. I developed my chops, played the whole summer, really got a good work ethic out of it. And I don't know, when you're in it, some people just, the way I explain it, it's like you feel compelled to do it. It's kind of a rush. So I did it earlier on in my high school career and kind of, I don't want to say got it out of my system, but got that experience. I really wanted to do that. And what's so cool about it now is a lot of my students at Miami are also very much into WGI and drum corps. And I can appreciate that perspective. One thing I did not like about studying at the conservatory level is there's a real, my teacher at Oberlin really frowned upon that type of playing and that whole scene, the drum corps scene. And they didn't really think much of it. But some of the stuff these guys and girls play it's incredible. And it's kind of its own art. I was marching at a time kind of like the golden age of drum corps, when Kevlar was still relatively new and things were starting to really get amped up. It's a really different activity now. The pit's amplified now, and there's a lot more going on, especially with the WGI, with the technical productions. And
it feels more theatrical to me sometimes than musical. Yeah.
Right. So I think I marched at a really good time. It was the second summer in '93 was the last summer that Star of Indiana performed as a drum corps on the drum corps circuit.
I went to finals that year, and still maybe my favorite show ever.
I was in Jackson, Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the guys that was on the snare line actually teaches the drum line at UC, University of Cincinnati now, is Nick Angelis.
Really?
Yeah.
Man, what a drum line.
There's some Bartok and Barber. It was really very forward looking. And we actually toured half the summer with them. We were on this circuit called DCI, or Drum Corps South, DCS. And we got to kind of see the development of their show. I didn't realize how good it was, but I think that show in particular was like the forerunner to like modern writing for drum corps and drum lines.
I agree.
But having that experience, I can totally understand, when a student of mine goes away every weekend to rehearse for their indoor drum line, like how compelled you feel to do it and the value of it. What I do find, I talk a lot about in lessons, is separating that technique from kind of your normal technique. There's a specific technique that goes with marching percussion, especially mallets, I find, but also snare drum, and kind of leaving that on the field or in the gym is important. And then softening up your touch and playing with less tension, on a regular basis it's a little challenging sometimes for them.
Yeah. But just bringing that work ethic and that to both places. I mean, because you're right. The time commitment and the hours that you spend rehearsing, I mean, I could see why someone, like yourself, it would set you up for success, because you were already mentally prepared for being in the practice room for 8 hours a day as you're preparing for an audition, because that's a short day compared to some DCI seasons, right?
12 hours a day. Yeah. Out in the hot sun.
Right. Yeah. So,
yeah, no, I value it, and I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. No, that's great. So after high school, you go to Oberlin and studying with Mike Rosen, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. How was that experience? Was it a lot of orchestral playing? Were you doing a lot of percussion ensemble, or just a blend of the two?
When I was at Oberlin, we had a fairly small studio. I think the most we ever had were 12 players, which for that size school was pretty appropriate. Anything more, it would have been too many, I think. But the first couple of years, actually, a lot of my teaching I've molded after kind of the path I took at Oberlin, because I think one thing he was really good with was kind of developing you as a musician first before like an excerpt jock. I practiced the excerpts a lot very early on as well, but I did everything else he told me to, all the Mitchell Peters books, some of the standard repertoire from marimba, like Time from Marimba and Tanaka, Two Movements from Marimba, and the Musser etudes, to kind of establish a good foundation in being a musician, not just, an orchestral jock, playing Porgy and Bess all the time. And, how I wound up at Oberlin, really, there was a certain amount of chance in that too. I auditioned for 5 conservatories, and Oberlin was probably the last place I thought I'd be because it was so expensive. And I think I'd be able to afford it. But it turned out that I got the best offer from there. And it kind of suited me well because it was smaller, a little isolated. And I was very introverted at that stage in my life too. So I just kind of tucked myself away and kind of lived like a monk for 4 years and just practiced. And the type of exposure, that I got there was good. There's some stuff I played there that I'll probably never get to play again, like that Legato piano concerto I was telling you about. We were going to play it. We had prepared it for a whole semester, and there's only like 2 or 3 pianists that have it in their repertoire. And the guy that was going to do it backed out, and they were going to have to pay somebody like $20,000 to come in and do it. So we never actually got to play it on a concert, but we did rehearse it, for a month, and I got to know that well. And there's some stuff we did there I know I'll never get to play again, which was kind of cool. And some of the percussion ensemble stuff too, we programmed like really, really kind of, I don't want to call it academic, but like art music that required, taking an hour to get your stuff set up, and very, very difficult. So I know I probably won't play anything like that again as well. In the real world, it's just too expensive to do, So Oberlin was a lot about, for me, just being in an environment where I could practice a lot and get a lot of playing experience. I got both of those there. What my teacher at Oberlin kind of allowed me to do, I don't want to say allowed me, but he was cool with it, was I would go into Cleveland and I took lessons with one of the Cleveland Orchestra players like once a month, starting my junior and senior year, to get more of an idea of, seeing somebody apply all these techniques and concepts in an actual real world setting, in a professional orchestra. Yeah. And the places I went to over the summer, I studied with Mitchell Peters for a summer at Music Academy of the West. And I went back to Tanglewood and got more exposure from the Boston Symphony players. So, Michael Rosen was my primary teacher at the time. I still was getting a lot of information from many other people too. I came back down to Atlanta and did some lessons with Jack Bell. When I would be visiting my family. I did a Mark's timpani seminar, one of the first years he did that. So I took all of it in. I would say, I needed to narrow it down to a more specific percentage, I would say, probably 55% of my early formation as a musician kind of probably came from Rosen, I think. As I got into grad school, I leaned more towards the way Freer played, which is, who I studied with in grad school. Yeah. But all along the way, I kind of had my own ideas too. And some teachers don't mind that. Some do. I think some of my opinions on things, my teachers saw very differently from me, but I've always kind of been a self-starter and had my own ideas. And that's kind of defined, my sound, I guess, or my approach to playing.
What type of things would Rosen or Freer recommend or encourage their approach on your playing? What type of things did they
so with Rosen, it was all about phrasing and cadence and musical line. Very he wanted you to play everything, even if it wasn't a melodic instrument, to play everything melodically. That's probably the best way to describe his overall approach to playing. When I studied with Freer, it was more about metronomic precision and technical, I don't want to say perfection, but really sound technique. Because the world he came from, he did more of auditions and more audition training and coaching that requires just that kind of absolute precision. So, Oberlin is very much an ivory tower place. And probably one of the things that I don't know what it's like now. It's been a while since I've been there, but I did find frustrating was that there was a disconnect from the real world, Yeah.
I mean,
we could make art music all day long, but that's not going to happen. You don't get that opportunity in the real, last weekend with the DPO, we did a Green Day show, It's the last thing you'd ever hear at Oberlin. Maybe not now. I don't know. But I think for many players, even former students of my own, they feel like, when you do go to a big conservatory and the teacher only teaches, they find that they're wanting more. They want to see that person playing in an ensemble. And that's kind of one of the big pitches that I've made with my position at Miami, is that, both me and the other teacher there, we both play full time as well. So whenever students want to see us telling them, see us doing what we're telling them in lessons, they can go see us do a concert, which is different from seeing your professor play a recital, when you're having to be on stage in front of several thousand people. And it's not just you. It's very different from watching somebody play a marimba solo, Japanese marimba solo by themselves.
Yeah. Right. And seeing what it, the give and take of being an ensemble player versus being a solo player too. I mean,
making money, being paid to play too. That's
right.
At the university level, you're essentially you're paid to teach and to do research, run ensembles, which is totally fine, but not being out there and being in the scene, which is what a lot of people, especially at that age, is more appealing to. I never thought I'd wind up teaching at a major university. I kind of fell into it. But on the flip side of that, what I did learn at Oberlin, I think, was pretty invaluable, and it helped to shape my approach to running a college program now.
Well, it's funny as you're talking about these different periods of your life, what be DCI or to Tanglewood or to Oberlin to Cleveland State. all of these things were eventually setting you up for the life that you get to live now, and the either the work ethic you have now or the knowledge of that you pass on to your students. I think it's quite remarkable that you're getting to use that knowledge and pass on that knowledge that you've been collecting for all these years.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, I'm a very different player, obviously, from what I was 20 years ago. So I'm still trying to learn. And I think a lot of the learning I've done is from listening to different types of music now. When you're in that mindset of taking auditions, you're pretty much, your listening process is dominated by orchestral music. So I've really branched out a lot in, like, especially the past decade or so, and gotten more interested in other types of music. One of my favorite artists now is Bjork. When she was releasing stuff when I was in high school and college, I didn't even think twice about listening to it. But I'm finding, I'm learning a lot from listening to music like that now. I got eventually into Radiohead, after I graduated with my master's degree, and I had some extra time on my hands to kind of branch out. And gotten a little more into like movie scores, some of the ambient type music. And one of my favorite aspects of teaching at the university is I can actually program concerts of basically whatever I want to do, as long as I can make the arrangements myself or find somebody to make arrangements for me. So I've kind of made that an emphasis, and we do kind of different types of percussion ensemble music that most places don't do, because we have somebody that does some really good arrangements for us, or I'm able to, like over the summer, get some ideas together and do arrangements myself of some other music. But I'd say, I'm still kind of learning. Probably the hardest thing, or the biggest difference now, is I don't have the sheer amount of practice time I used to, especially, after you get married. And I've got a 15, or he's almost 15. He'll be 15 in a week and a half. But, your time is much more valuable, and you just don't have the sheer amount of time you had to before. So I usually always try to have sticks in my hand when I'm, whether I'm teaching or practicing or in rehearsal, but to just have an unbroken amount of practice time is pretty rare now, because, you're doing a lot of different things and you're working. I do find myself, I do a commute into school. I think a lot about playing on the commute, and usually I'll think about, the lessons I'm doing that day. And when you're teaching the same stuff over and over again, year after year, you have to think about it differently. So that's one way I'm kind of continuing to learn, thinking about all the different ways I could break apart each measure in, like the De La Cluse snare drum etude number 1 from the 12 studies, and just know it backwards and forwards. And that will keep you from tiring of the music, and it also will make you a better player.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, but everything, leading up to this, I definitely feel like I've synthesized that. My opinions aren't nearly as strong as they used to be. When I was younger, I was much more opinionated, and I wasn't of the thought that there's only one way to do things, but I was pretty passionate about what I thought sounded good. But, as you get older and more experienced, there's a lot of things I enjoy listening to now, or appreciate in somebody's playing, that I probably would not have, when I was in my 20s. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how age and perspective changes your approach to maybe picking the things that are worth voicing your opinions on, and which things aren't.
Oh yeah, yeah, certainly I'm a lot less aware of myself now. I feel like when I play in front of my students, or if I make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. So
yeah.
I've kind of chilled out in that respect. I mean, I still try to play my best. I'll put it this way. It's like, I try to make sure everything I do is of a certain quality. And if I'm posting something online, it's not going to be a recording from my phone, So I'm still very aware of that. And I think that helps to keep you relevant, and it keeps you sharp, it keeps you from stagnating and sounding bad. That's the last thing I want to do is not sound my best. But I'm just not as hyper opinionated about it as I used to be.
Yeah, no, that's great. I wanted to ask about the studio you have at Miami. What are your students typically majoring in, or do you have ed majors and performance majors, or how does that?
Yeah, we have a mix. The majority are education majors. Some do both. education and performance. It requires an extra semester for student teaching. Right now, the way the breakdown works, we have just performance majors. We have 3. Our studio size is like 21, I think. I think it's like 21 right now. And then we have some Bachelor of Arts students, it's not really a minor, but it's like a co-major. Say you want to do like pre-med, but you're also a good musician, something like that. So you still get to have a degree in music, but you also have your other area that you're studying that you're ultimately going to do. Some Bachelor of Arts students do wind up in the industry. Some don't. I would say education, though, is the dominant program. There's just a good tradition at our school and a lot of success for ed majors. So, yeah, and I feel a little bit better about teaching an ed major, having gone through the rigors of developing a career in performance, knowing how difficult it is, and, knowing how many people want to do it and the level of talent. I feel better about somebody getting an education degree and having more of a sure thing. If you want to just do performance, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'll usually tell students, you pretty much can count on having to get your master's degree too. As a performance major, having those last 2 years to finish off and really hyper focus was definitely the best thing I could have done for myself. And you just need that extra time to really work on whatever it is, whether you're developing a solo career, trying to get connected with a chamber ensemble or taking orchestral auditions or just developing some type of path forward as a performing musician. You need 2 years just to basically practice what it is you're going to specialize in. For me, it was excerpt boot camp. I just did excerpts for 2 years as a grad student.
Yeah.
I find though, the ones that do both, if you're really passionate about playing, and you want to do both, that's also a good idea because you have a teaching license. And, some players who do have orchestral jobs might not even have a performance degree. They might have had their degree in education for the fact that it's a little more pragmatic. And, there's certainly more work out there for music educators in public school districts than there are for orchestral musicians playing snare drum roles, So.
Yeah, sure. It certainly increases your options of careers and job options, right? And
with ed majors, I make sure that, we don't dumb down the curriculum or anything. The focus is just a little different. We wouldn't focus we do like standard excerpts, but we wouldn't spend a whole hour necessarily just on Lieutenant Kiji on the snare drum for a lesson or something like that. So you get the same level of expertise, but not necessarily all the same material,
Yeah. And I've watched some of the videos. You have a fantastic YouTube channel, by the way.
Thank you.
I encourage everyone. I'm going to link it in the show notes. I encourage everyone to go and check it out. And some really fantastic solo performances, some great excerpt playing by you, and then some small ensemble stuff you've done. And then you also have videos of your ensembles from the university. Yeah. And I love how accessible some of the material is, in that it really opens up, I would say, for a broader audience, the material that you, as you were saying, that you have arranged for them. There's a Johnny Greenwood thing on there I really dug, and the electric counterpoint piece, that was really nice. I like what you're doing there, and how it's it's really opening it up to a broader audience, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many good music schools in Ohio, and, Cincinnati Conservatory is very close, that I wanted to kind of try to do some things that other ensembles weren't doing. And I think, people appreciate something different that's done well, so. Yeah.
So my son just finished at LSU studying percussion with Brett Dietz. And I noticed a similarity in that you both release a fair amount of content on YouTube, social media of your ensembles playing. And I do think that that's the world we're living in now, right? And I'm assuming that that's a good recruitment tool for the school, right? That
exactly.
When you're Yeah.
Yeah, it required an investment and getting better at doing it, But yeah, that was a big consideration, getting exposure and getting, kind of on the map. So that's a motivation it's kind of a project I like to do at the end of each semester too, almost like a final. But it is a really good recruitment tool. And a lot of times, like if somebody reaches out to me saying they want to come and visit, I'll include, some MP3s of performances and certainly the links because, seeing what a program produces is pretty important. And, and being able to listen to it too, like when you're at the checkout line or something like that, doesn't, you don't have to have headphones on to hear all these subtleties with, water gongs and bowings on vibes and things like that.
Right.
So, that also, and trying to get something to work on somebody's phone, something to sound good on a mobile device is really challenging. I find that, high frequency stuff tends to sound better because speakers are smaller on phones. So I kind of stay, especially my solo playing, kind of lean away from like timpani and marimba just because it doesn't translate so well. And most people are watching these videos on their phones. So
yeah.
So that also kind of, informed my decision about what to put up.
Sure. And I would imagine too, and it may not even be a conscious thing to discuss with your students, but I would imagine that their mindset changes a little bit, even compared to a live performance, than knowing that you're recording them, right?
Yeah.
They probably become hypersensitive to making sure that they're accurate and they're playing it well because there's going to be a permanent document of what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And at the beginning of the semester, I'll usually have it figured out what exactly it is that we'll be doing. And then, leading into the day we do it, I'll just give, gentle reminders, look at your part again a little bit and make sure it's there. And most of these, we don't spend much more than an hour recording. So, I think for the most part, people enjoy doing it and their parents especially like it. So it's good motivation for them to have their parts ready to go. But knowing that it's going to be out there for anybody who wants to see it, that is important. Yeah. So it started out pretty modestly. I started with one camera and just an external mic. And then as I got more proficient at it and editing and figuring out what works best, when we do a recording, it's a full day for me. A lot of moving around of equipment, and the actual recording is probably the easiest part. Getting all the mics set up, and I do it all myself. And the part I enjoy most though is the post production, editing and getting the sound just the way, the balance just right, and getting the camera angles looking good. That we've chosen to do. So
yeah, well, and I would argue that especially your excerpt videos are as good as anyone that's putting them out on YouTube.
Thank you.
And yeah, starting with the way you play them, but the way that you film them, the way you record the audio, and then in the editing, how you're dropping in scores. I mean, it's not just, hey, watch my hands while I play this part. It's let me show you what's happening in the music so you can see why I'm interpreting that this way and things like that. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason why I like to do those too is it is kind of like a catalog of your life's work. So I'm, almost treating them like they're little miniature recital pieces.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have, I've worked on these parts for the better part of my life now to catalog them and have a record of it, Yeah. And each one is like its own little piece of art. And some of the, I did a Prokofiev castanet piece, and I just saw the most standard, but I just love that music and something I kind of always wanted to do. So I found that, I started doing them more once I stopped taking auditions. It kind of filled the gap. When you're doing auditions, you feel like you always have this drive or an ultimate goal, a direction of something to work on. So in my head, I kind of have a queue of different pieces I want to present. And then I think about, the whole process of what instruments I want to use, kind of the approach I want to take, where I'll shoot it. I do a lot at my studio here, but I do a lot at school as well. And just stuff I think is interesting to play, And again, I also use it as a mode for recruitment too, because prospective students would want to see your work.
Sure. Well, it is funny as you're explaining all of that. I mean, I will tell you just from my own perspective, that's precisely what this whole thing is that I'm doing now with this. I'm documenting my life through conversations of people that I know, and I'm leaving something behind for my children to say, hey, this is what my dad did when he was learning how to play music and do all that. So I
feel like it's tangible. It's like, I played all these most of them I've played at auditions, but like it's after that moment it's done, like having like a tangible record of like an actual piece of art, that you produced is as much part of it as I use it for recruitment or for, displaying, my approach to playing online.
Yeah. I do have a quick technical question about it. When you're recording, did it take some time to figure out I'm assuming it took some time to figure out how to make the recording sound the way you wanted the instrument to sound as natural, and not adjust your playing to make the recording better, to make the equipment do the work instead of your playing?
Right. Yeah. With the mallets, it's what implement you choose a lot of times. I'll find I have to go with a much lighter mallet for the xylophone and glockenspiel stuff. With the snare drum playing, adjusting the levels correctly, not peaking the mics, like where you're putting the mics, makes it more difficult. But I usually always have a mic on the snare side, actually right by the snares, so you can actually hear like all the notes in the figuration of a 4-stroke rough. It's much more difficult to get that perfect take that you want, but it sounds a lot better, I think. Some of the hardest ones I've done, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, was really difficult to do. That one's gotten some good views because when you're playing it, I was playing it along with the recording, and sometimes it's hard to hear your actual playing when you're playing with the recording. And in the really difficult spot, the waterfall section, even when you're behind the instrument, sometimes it's hard to tell if you miss a note. So going back and listening to it and making sure all the right notes are there, that one I think took 38 or 40 takes or something. And another really hard one was the Hariano suite. It's short, but to get it to be in unison and to get all the notes to speak clearly, that was rather difficult. The last excerpt one I did in December, Capriccio Espagnol, that was a little more challenging to get the levels right. I kind of held off on doing that one because like soft playing on these videos, it's not as effective because you just don't hear it much, so.
Yeah. Did you record that one in a hall?
What's that?
Were you in a hall?
Yeah, I was in a recital hall. Yeah, for that one at school. Figuring out the right angles, probably the hardest part of the process, especially when I'm recording here in my studio, is like finding camera angles that are flattering. It's difficult. Like I want to look a certain way when I play, and figuring out, that the opaqueness of the lens really affects how you look on screen. It's true, that the camera does add 10 pounds. So
that's why my podcast is just audio, by the way.
So, you want to every aspect of it. I try to make sure it looks good, not just the playing, but how I'm presenting myself too. So,
yeah, sure.
And I spend a lot of time finding the right camera angles, and also so that you can see, the mallets or the sticks working, certain passages, finding the right camera angle for that as well.
I imagine after all of that, playing the excerpt has to feel kind of easy because you've had to do all these extra things in the process.
Yeah, sometimes not though. Like I'll listen back to it and I'll hear something that I was not aware of, I might have held the tambourine a little too close to the mic and it peaked or something like that. I'll have to go back and do it again.
Yeah.
So I tend to set my levels lower. The only problem with that is if it's not loud enough, then you have to, raise the decibel, the master decibel level, and you wind up with background noise. So I know my equipment well enough to where I've kind of streamlined the process, but it really just depends on when I'm playing. Anything like vibraphone's a little harder. I haven't really done much on vibes because it's harder to capture a really pure sound on vibraphone. So many frequencies happening, and I don't have like $10,000 mics, so I have to work with the best quality I can get from the mics I have. So, but I think overall, I do have a pretty good system going, and I just make sure that I try not to put stuff out too frequently. Too much I think is not a good thing. try to space things every couple months. There's a couple projects I'm working on that I've been meaning to do. They've kind of been in my queue. And a lot of it depends too on, my orchestra schedule and my school schedule as to, when I feel like I have the time to do it and when I feel motivated enough to like really do it well instead of just going through the motions and doing it.
Yeah. My last question for you is what do you do away from music other than being husband and dad?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do to take a mental break or maybe refill your tank for all this creative work?
I've always gone to the gym. I started, after I got out of school, got a gym club membership, and it's been there kind of on and off. But, when all that free time came available during COVID, I really, when I got into my 40s too, I was just aging more rapidly. I really got more into being really disciplined about hitting the gym like 5-6 days a week. So it's a good outlet, and you can literally, work your anxieties out there. I also, I'm interested in like film. My brothers and my sister are involved in the film industry, so I've got a pretty good eye for good film, good art movies. It's probably a lot of the music, that I do these arrangements from comes from, good composers from movies. Yeah. My son actually is into rocketry now, so I've been doing stuff with his rocket club. We did a launch last week. I was into bowling for a little while. That was fun. My wife does dressage. She's also a musician. She's a horse owner. So when I wasn't as busy working when we were first married, I was a little more involved with her hobby in that respect. And then outside of playing, other things in music I like to do. I like to, build instruments, build mallets, kind of come up with different ideas, different types of like trap stands, things like that.
Yeah. Building
things. I've always liked that. And then, I know it sounds weird, but sometimes I like to do yard work. It's kind of therapeutic, mowing the lawn or doing the edges or something.
Yeah, I have to do that this afternoon, as a matter of fact, and I'm not as thrilled about it as maybe you would be. It's okay. What does your son think about what his dad does for a living? Does he?
I think he's a lot like me and his mom. He's kind of easygoing, very, he's not quiet, but he's pretty reserved. And he, like me though, what he is into, he's really fixated on. So like right now he's in this phase where he's really into rocketry, and, it's pretty much all consuming for him right now. He actually has really good rhythm and really good time and good pitch because he's been around it his whole life, but he did lessons for maybe a year between violin and drums, and it's not for him. So, yeah. Which is fine. He's into rockets and coding and some gaming. He plays Minecraft. He went through phases too, where like he was into farm vehicles for a while, then trains, and then went through a Lego phase, and then cranes, and now it's looking like he's going to go in the direction of something involving technology, maybe coding or something like that.
Yeah. Well, listen, my son, as I said, just finished at LSU studying percussion, and he just moved to Austin, Texas, and he has a technology job, and he may not ever do anything with music again, and that's okay. I think that there's a lot of people that go that way, and I think there's some, just as we were talking earlier, building the discipline to do something through music is so transferable to every other aspect of your life, even if it means going into a different career, and I think that's what happened with him.
Yeah. Well, I found, being a musician is all consuming, and it's a little intense sometimes. I think when you're younger, like the highs are super high and the lows aren't, they happen, but you get over them a little more quickly. Just because of the nature of the business, there tends to be, especially, when like contracts are involved and unions are involved, there's definitely I don't want to say it's pessimistic, but it kind of overshadows, the fact that we're playing all this great music. And the reality of the arts is there's just not a lot of money in it. And I'm always, when summers lighten up, but, during the thick of our season and during the thick of my semester, I'm like always engaged in work. And that can be a little challenging, and it can produce anxiety, and it can definitely take the fun out of playing too, sometimes. So that's been a little challenging, and I'm not the type of musician that would say don't ever become a musician. Because I mean, I don't think that's a good way to go about it either. But it's definitely not for everybody. You know, it's not the easiest path to take for sure.
Yeah, it requires a full commitment to it.
Yeah.
Right. You can't half-ass do it. You have to do it.
Right.
You know. Yeah. Well, I can say, having met you many years ago, I knew even then that whatever you did, you went full on with it. And I think it's probably fair to say you tend to do that with everything, right?
Yeah.
You're full on. And I think your work output is a testament to that, to your commitment to it. So, you know, I know has to be really cumbersome at times and exhausting, but you're doing great work, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's
I find the amount of equipment you accumulate over the years it can be really dizzying, just keeping track of all the stuff. I had a future grad student. He's going to start in the fall. He came over today and we were looking at tambourines and working on some drums and stuff. And it's a lot to just to manage, you know. It's like an entire inventory of stuff. And
how many pairs of marimba? How many pairs of marimba mallets do you think you have?
Actually, I've pared down a little bit. I don't know. I would say between marimba, xylophone, timpani, I mean, easily 1,000 pairs probably at this point. Yeah. And snare drum sticks. Yeah. It's a lot to keep track of.
How many snare drums?
Snare drums. I used to have more, but I'm at like, I think 13 now. Concert snare drums, tambourines. I've kind of figured out, I have kind of my go-to stuff that I mainly use, but every now and then you have to use one specialty instrument for this or the other. We did Iberia by Debussy in January, and there's one tambourine that I used for specifically like one portion of that piece, and that's pretty much all I use it for. But when you have to do it, it's a standard piece, you know, it's there. So, so like I'll have this tambourine sitting around for like 5 years before I use it again, and just kind of like keeping track of stuff. It can start to weigh down on you a little bit. So I figure, you know, if there comes a point where I do retire, I probably could start a backline rental or something like that.
Yeah.
With all this stuff I've accumulated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michael, it has been an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you today.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been really good. So informative, and just more than anything, it's just good to catch up and see what all you've been doing, man. I'm just so happy for you, and I'm just happy for your students that they get to enjoy this incredible wealth of knowledge and history that you have in music, and I'm just thankful that you're passing it on to the next generation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, best of luck to you. I encourage everyone to check out Michael's YouTube channel. As he's releasing content consistently, you will not be disappointed, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Just a master on the as an educator and as a performer. It's really, really amazing stuff. So best of luck to you, and we'll stay in touch.
All right.
Yeah,
excellent.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Bandwich Tapes. I'm your host, Brad Williams. The show's theme is called Playcation and was written by Mark Mundy. Drop me a line at the email address, thebandwichtapes@gmail.com. Make sure to subscribe to receive new episodes of the podcast. And while you're at it, please tell someone else about the show. Thanks for listening.